Hi, I'm Dave Roggen. I'm the CEO of Deeper Solutions. We are a partner with the Faxis GPO. We're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about the HIPAA Security Rule, what it is, and what your responsibilities may be. So first of all, who are we? Deeper Solutions, we're a management consulting firm. We focused almost exclusively on cybersecurity. We take a holistic approach to cybersecurity, so we're not just focused on the technology. We'll also look at the processes that you have in place. Do you have the right rules in place? Do you have the right training? Do you have the right employees in place who can implement your security rules and your security strategy? And finally, are you keeping with compliance? Are you meeting all the requirements of your regulator? In your case, what we're talking about today is HHS. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, the first thing is, what is cybersecurity? We'll then talk a little bit about what the HIPAA security rule is. We'll talk about some of the growth in the breaches and the fines. We'll talk about what the security rule requirements are. And then finally, I present some sample pricing. This, most importantly, is for organizations to understand what it's going to take for them, what kind of investment are they looking at. So first of all, what is cybersecurity? Cybersecurity, it's the overall approach to protecting your most critical data. Again, it's not just about technology, it's about your people, it's about your process, it's about whether or not you're implementing your processes, it's whether or not you're doing all those things that you need to have in order to ensure that the privacy data and your patient's most critical health data is protected, as well as things like PII, which is personal information or credit card information, those types of things. So ultimately, cybersecurity has three main goals. The integrity of the data. Is the data not being corrupted, or people not able to go in and change the data who aren't authorized to do so? Is the data available? Can you get to the data when you want, on the device you want, in the format you need? And then finally, is the data being kept confidential? A lot of this is a direct manifestation of what the privacy rule is. Are you doing those things to ensure that only those people who are supposed to see the data, it's being kept confidential? And are you meeting, from a technical perspective, those responsibilities that you have around the privacy rule? So as I began to say just now, really, if you think about the HIPAA privacy rule, most of us know what that is. You go in, you sign a piece of paper. Those of you who are medical professionals, who are covered entities, you know what you can and cannot do with the data. You understand how it needs to be restricted to only people who need access to it, what your disclosure, how you're disclosing, and you need to keep track of those types of things. The way to think about the security rule is really the technical and overall operational implementation of the privacy rule. Are you showing, do you have the right safeguards in place? And from that perspective, there are really three safeguards that they think about. The administrative safeguards, which are, do you have the right rules? The physical are the devices, servers, all those things that may have access to critical data. Are they being controlled? Or do they have the right kinds of things? Like one example is, are you being locked out automatically out of your computer after 15 minutes? And then finally, the technical safeguards. These are things like firewall, malware technology, those types of things. And finally, compliance. That really is showing to administrators, showing to the right regulators, in your case, HHS, specifically the Office of Civil Rights, which is the organization that has the authority or has the responsibility to make sure that the security rules being kept. So let's talk about cybersecurity and the two main points of it. The first one's the security itself. This is everything we've been talking about, the people, the process, and technology. The compliance really is, do you have a plan in place? Are you doing it in a structured approach? Can you show people, in this case, again, the Office of Civil Rights, that you have taken a thoughtful and methodical approach to cybersecurity? Ultimately, from a compliance perspective, there are three main components. The risk assessment, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but ultimately it really is, you have an annual responsibility to assess your overall organization, to identify what risks you have, what risks have you mitigated, what your plan is to mitigate those risks that can't be mitigated right away. And then you have the responsibility to implement that security plan, to address those holes in your process, to show that you have a structured well thought out, well documented approach. And around that documentation, that really is the compliance. That really is all the documents that you have to have in place, as well as showing a documentation ultimately of what you've done. I've written this documentation, I've built this process, we're doing these trainings, etc. So a lot of small to mid-sized practices tell us, we don't really think this is relevant to us. We don't think that this is something we need to worry about. Well, as you look at how quickly cybersecurity threats are growing, it really is no longer an option to not take this seriously. We're seeing exponential growth across the healthcare industry. We're seeing major attacks. We're seeing anything from millions of records being stolen from large organizations to less than 1,000 records being stolen from small to mid-sized medical practices. Ultimately, as well, failure to be in compliance with cybersecurity can impact your meaningful use funds. I put this slide here so people can understand what are the types of fines, what are we seeing out there from the Office of Civil Rights when they go after different organizations. And by different organizations, I mean everything. On this page, we have an individual doctor, we have an ambulance company, we have a mid-sized hospital chain, we even have an organization, though they did not see patients directly, they did have access to PHI, and therefore when they had a breach and they showed they had not been in compliance or had not documented their compliance, they were also fined. So also what we hear a lot is, I'm too small, no one's going to come after me. Well, HHS, the Office of Civil Rights, they've gotten to a point where they've said, we've had these rules out for a long time. We've issued guidance for small practices. I didn't know is no longer an acceptable excuse, or at least no longer an excuse that OCR would work with you rather than fining you to make sure you came into compliance. So what are some of the things you're required to do? There's a number of things that you require: security training, contingency plan, etc. But there are also some things that are called addressable. These things also technically are required, but you do have the option to document why this is not relevant to your organization because of size or for whatever other operational reason you don't believe this is required of you. So there are many things that you have to have in place in order to be in compliance with the HIPAA security rule. Again, we talked about risk assessment. In fact, there's actually a number of them. A number of assessments that together are considered the risk assessment. You have to have training, you have to do a number of other things. For example, just before I forget, those assessments, you have to hold those for 6 years and you have to do them every year. One of the things you'll be responsible for doing is documenting where there may be a gap in your security strategy, and you have to document what your plan is to remediate it. What we've seen is when medical practices have identified a threat, had a remediation plan, the next year comes, the same remediation, the same gap exists, the same remediation plan exists. That's the kind of flag that if you are audited by the Office of Civil Rights, those are the type of things that will be a flag and will become an issue. So finally, I put this slide up, and this is a representative pricing to help organizations understand, all right, what are we talking about? What are the costs? And as you see here, though there are costs involved with it, it can be much cheaper than the fines that we talked about recently. Also, there are costs involved with cybersecurity that have nothing to do with fines. Having to reach out to 500 of your patients to say, hey, your data has been hacked, or it getting into the local newspaper and hurting your goodwill. More and more of these things are hitting the newspaper. You have to take your responsibility to look at this information, to understand where your cybersecurity responsibilities are, and to meet them. So finally, I want to include my personal information, my direct contact information. Please feel free to contact me directly if you have any questions about cybersecurity, around the HIPAA security rule. We believe that it's important as a society and that we have a responsibility to help folks understand what the threats are and how to begin an approach to address those threats. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me, and I hope to hear from you soon.